Workshoptag 2. Ich darf recht herzlich begrüßen die Referenten des heutigen Tages für akustisches Repertoire. Das ist einmal Pavel Serbin, Cellist, Ensembleleiter, großer Musikworkshop, der uns in dieses osteuropäische Repertoire einführen wird. Wir haben noch gestern ein Konzert gemacht mit einem ähnlichen Repertoire, Kammermusik in der DDR.
Ja, und noch 3 Orchesterstücke.
Und 3 Orchesterstücke. Kommt dann mal in Radio, hoffentlich kann es mir anhören. Und recht herzlich willkommen, Evgeny, Konzertmeister und Cellist.
Wer ist das?
If you don't mind, I speak English because then I feel more free than usual. And I think we don't need the instruments for a couple of minutes. So I just want to thank you for presenting me. The only thing that I can add is that as far as I used to play historical instruments since more than 20 years, I thought kind of responsibility, so being Russian, to bring this repertoire forward. And so I started my research not because I'm a musicologist, no, I don't have a musicological education, but I did it by passion. So I spent quite a lot of time in different archives, and my aim was to find the music. Because we had quite a complicated situation with knowledge about what happened in Russia in the 18th century. So my aim right now is to bring you into the context of this era, because I'm sure that you are very much in German, Austrian, the history of German music in the 18th century in Germany and Austria. This is something what you have from your childhood. Yeah? You are in this triangle of Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, and all the other wonderful composers around. But maybe you don't know what happened at the same time in Hermannstadt, in Hungary or Romania. Because everywhere there were capellas, everywhere there were churches, everywhere there were Kapellmeisters, and everywhere there were music that had to be composed. But because of some historical reasons, it was blocked in some archives, or burned down, or disappeared, or appeared somewhere else. So there should be a research, be done about that later. And the same was in Russia. We had the court, we had the court music, we had composers who were invited from abroad, native composers, and for quite a long time it was hidden from Europe, because in the 19th century there were no specific research about that. There were just small things, but not really systemized. And just at the very beginning of 20th century, there were wonderful men whose name was Nikolai Finlayson, who wrote the first history of ancient music in Russia, the music before 1800. The book was published in 1927. The next year, Finlayson died, and lots of sources disappeared together with him. And then in the Soviet times, I mean in Stalin and Khrushchev and Brezhnev times, there were a research that was much, much better than in the 19th century. But already many sources were just disappeared. The reason for disappearance of the sources was that, first of all, burning of Moscow in Napoleonic occupation in 1812.
Frenchman, good French.
And no interest for the past in the 19th century. So private libraries survived just occasionally. And then, of course, 1917, the year of the revolution and the Civic War, lots of archives burned down, lots of private houses with private libraries burned down, and things were thought to be lost. But me and my colleagues who are in the field of Russian music of the 18th century, we've done quite a lot of things in the second half of 20th century, beginning of 21st century.
Don't forget, and the German also, I have not... No, they didn't.
In 1812, there were Germans in the French army, whom... but there were also foreign legion in Russian armies, and it was a difficult time. Anyway, so this is the main thing about how it was, how the research was done. In the Soviet times there were few books on the history of Russian music. They were not really translated. That's why you, with knowledge of English or German, you could not read it. You had to know Russian to read them. And of course, at the end of the 20th century, the research was so active that these books became not useless, but less actual, very, very fast, with the opening of archives, with the new results of research. There were some musicologists who worked personally on some figures, like on Bortnyansky, Fomin, even on Anton Tietz, but this came in around 2000. So what did the history of Russian music look like? Of course, music was very much in use, mainly in churches, but you know that in Orthodox Church, no instrument. We have a very nice anecdote about that. So the Orthodox priest has been asked, why in the Catholic and Protestant Church you have organ in the service, and in the Orthodox Church nothing? He took a pause and said, yeah, but you cannot drink away the talent. Drink away the talent. So that means that you cannot sell the organ to have money to buy some vodka. But this is just a joke. We have a very nice book published a few years ago in Russia, in St. Petersburg, about instruments in everyday life of the 16th and 17th century in Russia. And the woman who made this research, she found all the sources saying that instruments were still in use. So in church it was not allowed, but in private houses there were lots of examples. Also, trumpets, drums had to be used in the army, and they were used, so people used to play this music. And instrumental music came into the official service in the time of Peter the Great Father, Alexei Mikhailovich. So he opened the first theater in Kremlin, and there were also a harpsichord workshop in Kremlin. I mean the workshop where they restored and made new harpsichords and organs, not a workshop like today here. Peter the Great had his own harpsichord. It was a gift for him as for a child. It was like a toy. Or another famous, interesting example that Alexei Mikhailovich gave a present to Turkish Sultan. He gave him a chamber organ as a present. So opinion about that time that there were nothing in Russia is not really correct. The only thing that we are missing is the music from that time. We have quite a lot of a cappella music. Some of it is very beautiful. We have this wonderful composer whose name is Vasily Titov, who's supposed to be like Russian Buxtehude, but everything without instruments, unfortunately. And in the time of Peter the Great, instruments came into the everyday life of the court. Peter was, you know, very much West-orientated, very open-minded. He spent quite a lot of time.
Johanna Bruno, bitte sofort.
This is not Peter the Great.
No.
And so he started thinking about making the royal capella, the royal orchestra, because he wanted the Russian court to look like as brilliant, as good as the courts that he saw in Europe. He was in Paris, he was in Holland, and he compared everything what he had seen to what he saw to what he had seen in Russia. He wanted the country to be more westernized. So he, the first thing he did, he bought a complete capella from Holstein that moved to St. Petersburg, and that was the fundament for the future capella. The two musicians who were responsible, who had musical duties in this capella were brothers Hubners, and looks like that in their duties was also to compose music. This music that didn't survive, but I saw personally in one of the St. Petersburg archive the parts for different pieces of 18th century with no names, unfortunately, but it was clearly German and French Baroque music. And so the parts came from that time, so it seems that it was a small part of the library that possibly disappeared. So we know that they used to play the same music as was played in Germany in the same time. There were German musicians. So this group of German musicians, they served as the teachers for Russians. So you understand, if you start teaching them in, for instance, 1720, you will get generations of virtuosos much later. So it took almost 50 years, but I have to say that Russian musicians were quite fast in understanding what their German teachers taught them. And you see that from the lists of players of the First Royal Orchestra, that there were quite a lot of Russian violin players, cello players, we know them by names, and they were playing in the orchestra together with their German patrons. Normally the percentage of musicians in the Royal Capella, it changed. So in the first half of the 18th century, it started from 90% Germans, 10% Russians. Slowly it came to 80% Germans to 20% Russians. And in 1800 there were something like 70%, 30%, and in the 19th century there were much more Russians, but they were with German names. Because these German musicians, they very much assimilated. They got Russian wives and they got children who sometimes became even Orthodox, but they still kept German names. So during the 19th century, you see lots of musicians with German names. Of course, Germany was not the only country that exported musicians to Russia. The court changed its tastes very much. They wanted to have Italians, of course. They paid incredible amount of money to have Italian composers. So in the first part of the century, in around till 1750, 1760, there were famous Italian composers, Reihe, working in St. Petersburg. There were Dresden composer Es-Dur, who was one of the first actually to work in Russia. His surviving pieces are from 1735, 1740. Later there were Manfredini, whom we'll discuss tomorrow when playing his symphony. Vincenzo Manfredini, don't mix him up with the famous Baroque Manfredini. And in 70s there were Trauer-Sinfonie, of course, famous Italian composer, and absolutely genius from my point of view, who worked at the court. Later he was changed by Giovanni Paisiello. Paisiello had his own story at the court. He could have stayed for a longer time, but he wanted so much money and he was so naughty that finally Catherine the Great kicked him out of St. Petersburg, but he went away with lots of money and with a Schuba. Yeah. So he got lots of presents. So there were questions.
The question about the pitch. Can you tell us, is there a description about
I
the pitch?
will when I come closer to the interpretation. Questions now we stay a little bit. I want to start with the historical context, but I will come to that.
Thank you.
Yeah, we agree on that. So Paisiello was for a few years, then he escaped. Then he, at the end of 80s, between 87 and 91, he was replaced by Cimarosa. Sarti was in Russia, so it was really filled with quite famous European composers. I also have to say that two really famous composers, whom you are performing a lot, were invited to the Russian court. That was Telemann, who refused, and that was Mozart, who refused. And Mozart was very much interested in that because he needed money. Russia was very attractive because of amazing salaries they got. So Mozart wanted to go, but unfortunately he died and he could not go and become Kapellmeister in St. Petersburg.
I refused by death.
Yes. So there were black men, but the white man came from Catherine the Great. Okay, it's a joke. And Mozart, Telemann, so they didn't come, but the others worked. Martínez Soler, I'm sure you know, the Spanish composer, he was very active at the Russian court. And this continued till into the 19th century. So foreigners were on a very high value and they were really important at the court. But slowly, Russian composers came. They came from the generations of those musicians who were taught There were not just the orchestra where German musicians taught the Russian musicians, but also, here we come a little bit to the Ukrainian question, because there were a place called Gluchov. Possibly you heard this name now with all this war news. So Gluchov was the capital of Hetman, Ukraine, where Hetman is a Hauptmann of Ukraine, had his residence, and it was Razumovsky. And so Razumovsky with Gluchov, with this city Gluchov, was responsible for sending good discounts for the court choir. So they were, so to say, imported. Of course, we know the history. Ukraine was not an independent country, it was part of Russia, and at that time nobody really cared about that. But Ukraine was really famous for good voices, for good discounts, and also boys. Yeah. Discounter was always boys in the choir, not like nowadays in historical authors practice. That was a bit too sexist, I'm afraid. Okay, so they were boys, and they were taught notations, and they could sing. So they were also obliged to study some music instruments, either harpsichord or violin or woodwind instruments. So from this cycle of educated musicians came also several good players, and first Russian composers. I wonder if you heard these names. I hope you did. So in early 70s we got this wonderful composer Maksim Sazondovich Berezovsky, who was originally from a Polish family based in Gluchov, and he was imported to the court as a singer, and then he became a wonderful composer.
That is one who composed music for Catherine II as Potemkin kept the Krim, and for her anniversary, and he became the Tsarist.
No, it's a different thing. He was supposed to work. We jump a little bit to get a great time. She wanted to open a conservatorium, and this conservatorium she wanted to open on the new lands that she took from Turkey. And she wanted to open the conservatorium in Kremenchuk. And she asked Sarti to become the director of the conservatorium, and he also chose people to serve in this conservatorium. So Berezovsky was supposed to work there, but he died a little bit earlier. So we don't know any piece from him composed when he came back to Russia, except one cantata he composed for Garibaldi, this famous singer, but he didn't compose. The pieces composed for Crimea that was composed mainly by Sarti. He composed large-scale Te Deums for that, so it's a bit different. But coming back to these two guys who came from Gluchov, Berezovsky and Bartnyansky. Evgeny Fomin, he was a student in the Academy of Art and Architecture, but he showed talents in music, so he became composer. But how? They all were sent with the state money to study to Italy. Berezovsky studied with Padre Martini and became Accademico Philharmonico the same day with Mysliveček and 1 year before Mozart. Bartnyansky studied with Baldassare Galuppi and stayed for 10 years in Italy. He put 3 operas on the stage in 2 in Venezia and 1 in Modena, so that was really good start for a known Russian composer. For him, he also went to Martini, but Martini was quite old and tired. And
Martini was Bologna or
yes, Bologna. Bartnyansky didn't study with Martini, but visited all the places in Italy. And the 4th Russian composer, no, there were 2 more. Nikolai Pomorsky, unfortunately his music didn't survive. He was a pupil of Starzer, but also studied in Italy. I know that because I saw the passing of the documents with him passing the borders. And the 5th one was Pyotr Skokov, who was the coursemate of Fomin in the Academy of Art, and was mainly an architect. And he also composed operas in Italy, and one of them was put on stage in Napoli. But when he came back to Russia, he stopped composing, or possibly we don't know something what happened to him in Russia afterwards. He died in 1816. We just have one opera by him remained. Plus, there were less known composers and musicians who worked either in St. Petersburg or in Moscow. And Tietz, whom we speak a little bit later about, he was an example of this type of people. Now we come slowly to how the musical performance practice looked like in Russia at that time. There were three types of important music-making centers, orchestras. They were private capellas. They were almost the same as in Europe, with one detail. Mainly, they consisted on served people, because those who can afford keeping the private orchestra, who had enough money to keep an orchestra of from 15 to 40 people. They were also owners of people in Russia till 1861. So they used this as a possibility to make an orchestra and to have their, I call it CD player. This was the CD player because that was the only way to listen to the music. Either to play yourself, to hire someone, or to pay less and to have served people in the orchestra.
To own the musician.
To own the musician,
Like
yeah.
Veichtner.
Yes. And this type of capella, I'm working quite a lot with the history of these capellas because my main subject is a private capella of Sheremetov family, where they normally had three German musicians: the first violin, the first cello, and the oboe. So they gave all the lesson to this really very young children. So in the list of capella you can find musicians of 8 years old, but they were ready to perform. They were able to perform symphonies and accompanying in the concertos. This sounds a little bit weird, but that was the beginning of the capella, and then they grew and they became musicians, and then they took the new generation of boys and taught them to play instruments. But there were a very bad thing about this practice, because, for instance, Sheremetov's wife died and he lost interest for the music. Before he was very much interested in the music. He built opera houses, he had this wonderful capella that was thought to be the best in Moscow, but then he lost this interest. And so, these people from the orchestras, they got new occupations at his private court, like servants. They were not playing instruments anymore. I find that to be stupid, but that was the mentality of the time. It's really a big disaster. So that was one type of capella. And when you ask me about interpretation, so I think in general interpretation in Russia was the same as in Europe, but with the detail that lots of served people had to play the music. At first you can think, okay, a boy is obliged to start playing the violin, but of course there was so much served people. Like Sheremetov had around 200,000 served people, so he could choose the best ones. And he also had some villages in Ukraine, and he also sent his professionals from the orchestra there to choose the best talented boys. So I think that in general the orchestras were not that bad that we can expect with this system of education. The second type of orchestra was the royal orchestra. No, we come to it a bit later. The second type was the theater orchestra. Here I would like to speak a bit more about Moscow, because in St. Petersburg there were the court theater, but in Moscow there were much more private theaters. And the building that you know nowadays as a Bolshoi theater was founded in 1774 as a private entreprise of a man called, whose name was Maddox. He was an Englishman, very eccentric. He came to Russia as a... he used to build these machines, the music machines, sometimes with clocks, that made some strange things, and some figures were moving, and puppets, etc., etc. I'm sure you saw that in some museums nowadays. So the machines that he did, they still survive. There is one in Kremlin that is still on its place. And he was very much interested in theater. He also wanted to have money out of the theater performance. And there were problems with the theater building in Moscow. At first it belonged to the court, then it became private, and it was not successful, but then came Maddox, and he made the theater very, very successful. And for this theater, he invited musicians from around. So there were people who did their, did their gigs in this theater, so they could be from some private capellas of private owners in Moscow, but they also worked in this theater. And there were people who were really in the list of musicians of these theaters. Some musicians were also brought from abroad to fulfill the group. But normally the orchestra was not that large until Maddox built a new building. And in this building the pit was larger. So the list of musicians consisted of 12 violins. I wonder if they played at the same time. Not sure, it depended on the situation. And the complete group of woodwinds and brass with no trombones and clarinet, but already with the clarinet. So the clarinet came into its practice very, very early. So there were theaters. There were also private theaters that were connected to the private capellas, and they played all type of music. Symphonies, concertos, operas, just everything was possible. Of course, there were less good orchestras in Russian Provence, where they could not find good musicians, or it was too expensive to hire a nice German violin player to take care of this capella. So there are quite lots of memories from the time about bad quality of these theaters. And also there were lots of amateurs who wanted to make music. They participated in big projects of big orchestras, like they wanted to play an oratorio, for instance. They made an orchestra up to 200 people, and so they hired all the amateurs from around. But I'm sure you know that also from Europe, that there were the same things in Europe. So I want to prove that the connection was very, very, very strong. And amateurs also used to make the house music. So they needed chamber music, and they needed Kapellmeisters even for very, very small orchestras they could afford. Like a group of 9 people was still an orchestra, and it needed also the Kapellmeister. So when you read Moscow newspapers of that time, you can see lots of advertisements. One was like, a man wants to hire a Kapellmeister for his capella. And then with addresses, I can sometimes know even the family name of this man, because I'm in the context. Or the opposite. The good Kapellmeister wants to find a job. This was very, very, very common. Or sometimes, a good Kapellmeister for harmony music is searching for a job. There were one more extraordinary thing that was in Russia at that time, and that makes it a little bit different from Europe. I wonder if you heard about something that is called the Russian horn band. You can also search in YouTube. Well, I could have done it as a presentation now, but it will need more time. You can do that on your own, because now in St. Petersburg there is an orchestra like that. So the idea came from Czech horn and cello player Mareš, who was a Kapellmeister in the family of Narishkin. And Narishkin was very much interested in the hunting music. And Mareš gave him an idea that if you get an orchestra just of horns playing all the chromatic scale, you can make an orchestra like an organ with each person playing one organ pipe. And so he constructed that orchestra. At first the instruments were made of brass, and they were still made of brass. But Jakob Stalin, do you know this name? He was a flute player in Bach Collegium Stalin. Yeah, Stalin, not Stalin. He was a flute player in Bach Collegium Museum, and later he became the director of Academy of Art in St. Petersburg. So he writes in his sketches on music in Russia that they also made an experiment they built a wooden box with holes in it, and they inserted all these horns. The horns were from this, the top one was this size, till 3 meters. They inserted it into this box and got a very nice color of the sound. I wonder if anyone can afford this experiment nowadays. I think it would be a bit expensive. Some of the horns were made in the same way as serpento, as zinc. So they were made of wood with a leather on it. So the aim of this orchestra was to play on plein air, because it could be heard for more than 20 kilometers. You can compare that to Alpenhorn nowadays, because this is a good thing. But imagine how difficult it was to play this orchestra. You had from 18 to 40, or better to say from 40 to 18 people in this orchestra, because in the large orchestra each person played just one note and had to wait until the beat. But in the orchestra of 15 people, they used to jump from one note to another. And I know from some sources that they also made several horns with klappen. So maybe the top horns, because it was a bit too complicated to play the melody. So they had to rehearse for quite a long time to get the music. But we know from the sources, like famous sources was Ginrichs, who wrote a small book about the art of horn playing, a Russian horn band playing in the late 18th century, so that they could perform Haydn symphonies easily, with no strings, but just horns. So the score looked very curious. They were just lines with tact, and then they were just a sign when you play, you know. But imagine they did crescendo diminuendo. They did sforzando was easy. Okay, it's on the beat. So the one who plays S in D major never has sforzando. That's unusual. Yeah, and why do I speak about this? Because from about 1770, composers like the royal composer Raupach, and also Sarti, and also Fomin, and also Bortniansky, they started using the Russian horn band as a part of the orchestra. Imagine the possibilities. With just 3 trombones, 2 horns, and 2 trumpets, you can get certain scale. But of course, with a remark about natural possibility of natural horn. But with the Russian horn band, you can get the chord of up to 5 octaves, and you can get any chromatic chord. So composers realize that it can be used for some very interesting effects, for loud effects and also for all these infernal effects. So famous examples of this is Requiem of Józef Kozłowski for the death of Polish King Poniatowski, who died in St. Petersburg. So the big score is composed also with the horn band. The horn band was also used for the dance music. It was very famous. So Kozłowski composed polonaises always with using of the horn band. In the scores, it was notated like Klavierauszug, just chords. But then the Kapellmeister had to rewrite it into this funny score, and then to copy parts out of that. So that was element of practice of the time. So,
what I was looking is Kozłowski. I was looking for the name I wanted to tell you before.
Yeah, Kozłowski.
He wrote the music for Catherine II as Potemkin took the cream, and it was so nice music. It became Tsar.
Yes, he wrote an opera that is now lost, unfortunately.
Very strange. The hymn of the Tsar of Russia was created by a Polish guy.
Oh, Kozłowski is an really interesting subject. He was a military, just from an army, but he was an amateur as a composer, but he was quite educated. And he came in around 1790, 1791. Potemkin brought him to St. Petersburg. And later he became one of the directors of Royal Inspection of Royal Theatres. So he was very, very important, and he really composed a lot. But no symphonies by him survived. Just mainly dancing music requiem, few large-scale works, and few operas.
And this music was the hymn of Russia. That is very strange thing that the hymn of Russia, Tsar, was composed by the Polish.
No. The hymn was composed by Botniansky. Yeah, I understand what you mean. There were a polonaise with a choir, Grom Победы раздавайся. Yeah, it was in use as a national anthem, but there were other anthems also in use. Also the German and the English, God Save the King, that was still in practice. They really didn't care about it.
And Marseillaise at the end.
Yeah. Marseillaise, there were difficulties after 89. After 89 it was forbidden, there was censure for all the music that came from France. Now, if anyone has any questions, I wonder if I missed something from this. Oh yeah, the Royal Orchestra. Because we have lots of documents from the Royal Orchestra. We know all the names of the players through all the 18th century. Many of these players were also composers, and I was very happy to find their music. I will tell about some of them. So let's start from Tietz, because he was the first violin, and also A.Veichtner, whose symphony is in the future project. He replaced Tietz on the violin position. They were Tietz. His father was a Bohemian who played the trumpet in Razumovsky Kapelle. And then Razumovsky moved the Kapelle to St. Petersburg, and then it could be that Anton Tietz was born in Russia. There is still no provement of that, because I was not happy to find his church record. So possibly in the future. Or he could be born in Europe and then brought back by his father as a young child to St. Petersburg. Yeah. He was so good that Catherine the Great sent him back to Europe to study, and he studied in Wien, and he studied in Italy for 6 years, and he was pupil of Haydn. This is something what I told when we rehearsed this concerto for the first time, but there were lots of people who were not there, so I should say it again. On one of his quartets, he is marked as l'élève de Haydn. So Haydn didn't mention him in the list of his pupil. We have this list just from the interview that Haydn gave to someone, Dietz, who has no connection to our Dietz, but Dietz is not in the list of pupils, but that doesn't mean anything. There were lots of people who took lessons from Haydn, and from the music of Dietz that we play today, it's really visible that he knew the style of Dietz very well. And I can imagine he took some lessons from Tomasini, and I have a small impression that when he was in Italy, he took lessons from Nardini. We also don't have direct proof of that, but the concerto that you will perform today was composed in these years, so not in Russia, but when he did study in Europe, better to say in Europe. And the only source that we have came from a shop in Florence, that sold it in the form of manuscript. So it's clear that that could happen to the pieces that were composed somewhere in this area. So I have strong impression that he studied with Nardini, because Nardini in Florence was very attractive for lots of musicians from Europe to come to study violin with him. So then Tietz came back to St. Petersburg. He was already in the list of musicians. He had a contract with the Royal Orchestra since 1771, and he went to Europe in 1775. So this is to show how important he was. And then he became the first violin of the orchestra. We have lots of sources describing him performing chamber music in the closest cycle of Catherine the Great, leading the orchestra during almost all the opera performances of that time. Looks like that he was also an important link between Vienna and St. Petersburg, because he was bringing Mozart and Haydn's, especially Haydn's music to Russia. There is a big collection now located in Tsarskoye Selo, This is a big palace near St. Petersburg, where there is a collection just filled with Haydn symphonies. And I think that Tietz was responsible for that. We have nice source speaking about him playing, because when Ludwig Spohr came to St. Petersburg in 1802-1803, he spent 1 year in St. Petersburg, he wrote several things about Anton Tietz. He visited Tietz in his flat. They played quartets together, but just two. Just two people playing quartets, because Spohr says Tietz took the bass, and in some Russian research it's marked that he possibly played cello. No, he took the bass part and played it on the violin. That was the practice. But imagine Haydn quartet. They played Haydn quartet just with two instruments, and they liked it. And then Tietz read from the music that Spohr brought him. Spohr brought him a duo for two violins, and Tietz just read it, and Spohr was very, very amazed by this. And then Spohr came to a concert where Tietz performed a violin concerto. I wonder if this was this piece, could be another, because there are two more concertos by him survived, but in 1802 he should have composed more. And there is one wonderful thing that Spohr writes. He says, for some reason Mr. Tietz played the concerto 2 times. 2 times, no more. And then I saw that all the cadences were improvised, because both times he played different cadences. Isn't that nice? Yeah, and Spohr said some strange thing. He said, yes, as a composer, he is definitely a genius. He uses this term, genius. But as a performer, he is a little bit old-fashioned because of this jumping bow. Old-fashioned jumping bow. Isn't that nice?
We talked about that yesterday.
Yes. So there were lots of jumping things in solo, in orchestra playing. Tietz was he had a mental illness. Looks like that he had either melancholy or hypochondria, and he stopped speaking at a certain moment. But Spohr said that he spoke to Tietz, so that means that he somehow communicated with people. But he used to speak just strange things. So it reminds me, you know, like sometimes you are going in U-Bahn and there is a woman walking and speaking to herself, so that would be something like that. But he still was able to lead the orchestra, the main orchestra of Russia. When he got this illness, the court wanted to have another good violin player. They had negotiations with lots of people, also with Bayeux. We know that from a report of Fétis. Fétis that's the only source that who says that Bayeux was invited to the court. But earlier there were another man, Franz Adam Veichtner, whose music will be played. Franz Adam Veichtner was a pupil of Bender and was a leading violin and Kapellmeister and composer in Mittau. So in Mittau there were wonderful capella. We don't have, unfortunately, any research done about this capella. I don't know the reasons, maybe the archives disappeared. I know that in Baltic states there are some archives, but I don't know if any of Baltic musicologists wanted to take some research about that. At that time it was Kurland, so it was German land, and Biron, the Count of Kurland, at a certain moment decided to leave all his duties about Kurland, and he just gave it to Catherine the Great. So, if I'm not mixing things, in 1797 he gave the whole land to Russia, and he went to Wien. He built palaces everywhere around Europe, also in Paris, and looks like that Capella didn't know what to do afterwards. So Franz Adam Veichtner went to St. Petersburg to try his fortuna, and he found it. At first he was not as well paid as the other musicians at the court. That was very strange, because he was already absolutely virtuoso violin player. But later he climbed to a very high salary, especially after Tietz died. And in St. Petersburg, Veichtner composed many pieces for violin, maybe also for the orchestra. They didn't survive, but some chamber pieces survived. And the symphony that we will play tomorrow It's a funny symphony because it's a Russian symphony based on Russian songs, but it was composed before A.Veichtner went actually to Russia. This is absolutely an outstanding example how a German composer paid attention to what happened in Russia, and he used original Russian songs in the symphony. So the symphony was published in 1771 in not in Mitau but in Riga at Harknov, and I have no idea if it could be performed in Russian court, because all those from you who read the symphony in 2 months, yeah, you could see how difficult were the horn parts. Looks like that these horn players were just in Mitau, not in St. Petersburg. I could not find any horn part of that difficulty in St. Petersburg.
And
So-
we need a 10 horn player or
10?
with 10 horn players. Not a horn band.
The horn band, you mean? Yeah, could be, but in Mitau there were no.
Because we had last time 2, it was enough.
It was not enough. Yeah, but it's so high. I wonder if this horn should be like this. We can keep it in the pocket. Yeah. So I think we can speak about Bayor later, because I have lots of things to tell about him. There are many names. We cannot do in 1 hour. I can tell you about each member of the Royal Orchestra who composed music, who played in certain concerts. Also, my main, so to say, subject is Moscow music, about the concert life of music, who performed, what pieces they performed. This maybe will be too much. But now, if you have any questions, just ask me, and maybe I will remember something else what could be interesting for you.
Could it be can you recognize the speciality of the style, or it's just
Yes.
everybody comes?
Yes, good. Thank you very much for reminding me of that. It's the question of what music they performed there in the second part of 18th century. First of all the European music was sold through the shops, music shops. You can see the catalogs, and there are lots of pieces by famous European composers. So the link was very strong. Then there were music that these Kapellmeisters in Russia, they were obliged to compose. And we have lots of pieces that are composed in 100% European style. So if you don't know whose music is played, you can mix it up with Haydn, Van Hale, Dietersdorf, and it's the same. But thing is that it's very particular, very special, also about the Symphonie Russienne. These are the experiments that composers living in Russia started doing since around 1750. The experiments of installing the national songs into the structure of the symphony. There were a few methods. Okay, I'm speaking not just about symphony, but also another type of chamber music. The first was to write variations. That was kind of common thing.
Right.
Variations, just variations
yes.
on a song. And it depended on the talent of a composer who either composes some kind of technical stuff, not interesting, or tries to make real artistic piece out of that. The second way was to install the original song into the modern European sonata form. So the idea was quite easy, but not so easy to make. So the main subject, one song; the second subject, second song; the third subject, the next song; the beginning of development, maybe one more song as an episode, etc., etc. So we see that from Weitner Symphony. Yesterday we performed this Vanchura Symphony with the same method. Sometimes it sounds a little bit like potpourri, but it depends on the talent of composer. Yesterday, all the people who listened to Vanchura's symphony told me that they like the music very much and that they think it's a great piece. So that means that it worked. Anton, yeah.
Just a question about this. Why would they include those songs into that? Why would they do that? I mean, what's that? When exactly does it happen?
Yeah,
Is
the
it
first
a
example.
thing? Is it a popular thing?
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
it a change in public? Yeah,
I got it. So the first example were the symphonies of Dall'Olio I know I gave you one symphony, you didn't like it very much, but anyway, that was the very first example of trying to install these songs. Because the court looks like that they asked these composers to do that. They like to sing these songs, the national songs, there were lots of them, either Russian or Ukrainian. And so composers were listening to normal people just performing it or singing it, and someone asked them to do that. So they tried it already. Jakub Stellin describes those two symphonies of Dalorio. He says, yeah, but the most famous pieces were these two Symphonie Russe that Dalorio composed, and they were really very much loved at the court, and they were performed very, very often. So looks like that when Ernst Vanchura did that, he tried to follow the example of Dalorio. I wonder if he knew his music, but Tietz also did that. He composed one of his quartets. It's just composed out of 19 national songs. So in the sonata form, he used it like I already described. In the romanza, that's the middle movement of this piece, he puts one song as a refreno, the second song with variation as an episode, then again refreno, then the next episode, the third song, etc., etc. And then in the rondo, it's so easy. Episode, refreno, episode. Also, the most difficult for them, as for composers, was to put songs together in the development section. I think that Mr. Haydn could have done it easily. For the other composers, it's not so easy. That's why, from my experience, I can say that they preferred using it as episodes in development section.
But was it sort of the trial to create a Russian style from nothing? And it's both reasons. There's homage to the people who gave the money for the musicians. I mean, this is what Beethoven did with the Razumovsky quartet. This was an homage for Razumovsky because he commissioned those quartets. But it was, I mean, the need to create a Russian style.
Yes. This is a good question. It's continuation of what I was going to say.
Yeah, same subject. It also happened in Western Europe at that time, right?
Yes, but from my point of view, yeah, there was some Quarto National, Symphonie Nationale, you can find them.
In England.
Yes, they did that.
And I just have a lack of knowledge in this. Who were the audience in that particular time? Because I mean, we have the French Revolution in Western Europe, of course, but how did the audience, I mean, do you know about this?
Yes, there are two questions in one. Let me answer first your question. The national symphonies of Dalorio, Vanchura, they were performed in the so-called big and small ermitages of Geto the Great. The audience was about from 30 to 80 people. Mainly, that was the Russian aristocracy, elite, and lots of ambassadors as well. We know them by names who were in these ermitages, and so that was a little bit, But in the opera houses that were visited by just normal local people, not from the court, there were lots of operas based on national songs. So that was asked from the democratic audience, so to say. And lots of composers, especially in Moscow. In Moscow there were a guy who is one of my favorite, Johann Joseph Kerzelli, who was one of the first Kapellmeisters in Petrovsky Theater, Bolshoi Theater nowadays. So he was the one who brought this method of taking the libretto, and in the libretto they asked librettists to make the texts of the arias in the same manner as the famous songs. And so it was marked, this aria should be made out of that song. So they arranged the songs as arias. It's a long conversation because there were different type of arrangements of the songs, sometimes in just couplets, sometimes also in sonata form. But that was very much asked for. But now I come to your question about
These songs are still popular now in Russia?
I will answer that question and then yours. Both questions are very good. So, it came slowly. I have to say that it was Mr. Tietz who was responsible for that. Later, or at the same time, it was Bortnyansky. They came to the idea that it's possible to compose not with a citation of the original song, but to compose à la Russe. So they took the elements from the song, like the dancing elements, or the lyrical the elements, or this type of specific plagal harmonization. So quite a strange harmony, sometimes unisonos, and it immediately brought them to a nice, unexploded style. Also, the idea, especially for foreigners who worked in Russia and for European composers who composed in quasi-Russian style in Europe, was to make this kind of barbar style. So for them, all that was behind the border was barbar. And so some funny things, but these funny things came from Kazakhs, from the dancing of Ukrainians and Russian Kazakhs, and that was very normal. So in the music of Anton Tietz, not in this also in this concerto, in the last movement, we start feeling that this music is not a citation, but it's not anymore 100% representation of European classical style. And your question was?
It was the song of that time, the popular arts.
Yeah.
Are they still popular now?
Yeah.
Like Oktober,
Yeah.
or the
First of all, French songs. Are you from France?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the French songs were very, very popular, and Alsace? Okay. So the French songs were very popular, and this cycle of composers, they also used to use Au matin de musette, Relâche de mon amant, all these songs for their pieces, and starting in 1770, there were the first books of Russian songs published, so just a collection of songs with notations and text. Also with harmonization. The first one by Trudovsky was with a figured bass. Later he realized the figured bass into kind of Klavierbegleitung, but sometimes with some obbligato passages. In 1790, there was the famous Prach book, where Beethoven took the Russian songs from. It consisted of almost 200 songs, and there were 600 examples printed. So they were also exported to Europe. Then two German publishers of in St. Petersburg, Gestenberg and Dietmar, they published another book that contained either national folk songs and some famous songs from the operas that became national songs. I can give you several examples. Maybe this is too deep into the subject. When parts of the operas became folk songs. Now we think they are folk, but they were really composed. Yeah, and then here comes the question: for how long time these songs survived in the future? They didn't survive. Just maybe 10% of them my mother sang when I was a child, or I know that they are in use. So when I go into this collections of the songs, I find wonderful melodies, but they are not so famous. When we perform music of this period, like Kandoshkin variations or Tietz music, we recognize the songs, they become more common for us. But it was not really in our, so to say, culture. Just a little bit of them. But they are so nice. I even had a crazy plan, sometimes going kayaking and taking guitar and in the cycle of friends to sing those songs, but not the modern songs that we used to sing. So they should come back. Yesterday in the symphony there were lots of songs, but there were several Ukrainians in the hall. They recognized the style of Ukrainian song, and one song was famous, but the rest they didn't recognize.
Was influence of Stalin, like in the Cultural Revolution in Peking?
No, with this not. In Stalin it was Stalin time. It was even different. They used to ask modern composers of the time to compose in the style or make one national. By that time, it was already a little bit. Yeah.
So the city won't do a tour in Russia because everybody will recognize the songs.
They will possibly recognize the style, or there are few people who know that. Even these editions, rare editions of the songs that were made in Stalin times, they were published like, 300 examples, and they were just located in libraries. So luckily I was lucky to, I have copies of originals, of course, and also these nice editions of Stalin Times. I have them, I bought them with the internet. One of them was stolen from the library, I see that from the sample. Yeah, but I don't want to give it back to the library, I have to say. Yeah, so I hope this is enough as a kind of context. The main thing that I wanted to prove, that St. Petersburg was not very much a province from the musical point of view. The performance practice, the music culture grew so fastly, so quickly in the 18th century, that by the second part of the century we had national composers. I didn't touch now too much as Russian composers. It's a big subject. I'm just recently I discovered that the next year there will be Bortnyansky opera in Bayreuth. So it would be so nice if you could visit it, because the opera is very good. It's with the Wiener Academy. They want to perform it there, and I hope maybe now it's a good. It's a bad times, of course, but it's a good chance for this music to come to Europe, to be heard and also loved, because it's really good music.
The so-called harpsichord concerto by Bortnyansky, this is not original. It's a sonata and then
No.
converted in the
No,
20th century.
wait.
Oh,
I got the question. Concerto by Bortnyansky.
Yes.
Bortnyansky, do I have a little bit of time?
yes, of course.
Yeah. But Bortnyansky was very lucky in his lifetime. He was sent by Catherine the Great to Italy. He lived in Italy for 10 years. Then he returned to St. Petersburg. He became a Kapellmeister at the small court of Pavel I. At that time he was the Grand Duke. He was waiting until Catherine dies and he becomes an imperator. So Bortnyansky was a Kapellmeister at his court, replacing Paisiello. And in 1797 he became a director of Royal Singing Capella. And he served as a director till his death in 1825. When he died, he published few of his pieces, but not the instrumental music. And when he died, his widow gave his manuscript archive and also archive of engraved plates to the court. She wanted 5,000 rubles, that was really a lot, that was his 2-year salary. Alexander I gave a little bit less, and all the music was brought to the Royal Capella Library. In the 19th century, yeah, and we have the index of the pieces that were given to the Capella. It's a very complicated document. Imagine, the widow describes each name of a cappella concerto that Bortnyansky printed. So she describes each set of plates with a name, and then at the end she writes, Italian operas, 5. French, Italian and Russian arias, duettos, etc., 30. Cantatas, 50. And then overtures, concertos, sonatas, marches, 4. Violin, woodwinds, harp and clavier and other instruments. 61. So I think it's a normal set of music that normal European composer could have composed at that time. And then this collection was there, and during the second half of 19th century, it was absolutely, everything was stolen from the shelves. So at the beginning of 20th century, when Findeisen worked with this collection of the Capella, he could find just few things. Among these things, there were the so-called album of Maria Feodorovna, the wife of Pavel I. She was an amateur klavierspieler, and Bortnyansky was her teacher for harpsichord and composed sonatas particularly for her. Findeisen left us the description of this album. He wrote in a catalogue all the pieces that were there, and there were also one concerto for harpsichord in a different tonality, and several pages were taken away. Those pages appeared in an auction in France in about 1880, and now they are kept in the Bibliothèque Nationale. This is the first movement from this concerto. When we calculate how many pages are in this harpsichord part of this concerto, we see that in Findeisen's description there were 10 more pages missed. So that was the second and the third movement. So the piece that is called Bortniansky Concerto is the first movement from a harpsichord concerto, the Klavierstimme with reduced tutis, and no second and third movement survived. Hope to find them. And
survived only the solo.
Only the solo.
Harpsichord part.
So
the orchestra part is rewritten by.
that's the next question.
Oh, right.
In 1985, he's still alive, the guy from Kiev decided to make a reconstruction of this piece. I made a new one in 2004 because for me it was clear that the piece should have 2 oboes and 2 horns, because Bortniansky was always composing this combination of instruments. And I made another reconstruction that we recorded in 2004, just this first movement. And then it started sounding like a real concerto. So I'm proud of myself. Yeah, because with this reconstruction from Kiev, it always sounded a little bit strange.
It's odd. It's odd. Yes.
Yeah, it's odd. I can give a present for Concerto Köln. I can send you my score with parts. Maybe now it's a reason for me to make a revision of it, because I did it quite a long time ago. Maybe now I changed something. I try to be very, very careful when reconstructing something. So this is the history of this concerto. It's really a pity that 2 concertos by Bortniansky were lost. From the other one we have just incipits. Diesen left incipits, so we know this music. And some of the pieces were copied. And maybe one day the album will survive. Diesen had it in 1927, and then it disappeared. But in 2009, there were an opera Bortniansky, an autograph of his opera Alcide found. It was in Register, in the index of Capella. It was also described by Diesen. It disappeared after the revolution. And then in 2009, one Russian actor who was in evacuation during the Second World War, he told to the library that he gave his score to, that his family had the score. So somehow it was stolen. And maybe that's not for YouTube. He sold it for the National Library for 60,000 euro. This autograph. Yeah, but that was a very interesting thing, because we had this opera from the other source, from the copy that is kept now in London. And in this autograph, several pages were taken away. But
separately.
But in this opera, there were the choir from this opera that Bortniansky later rearranged for the choir with the woodwind sextet of clarinets, horns, and fagotti. It was almost the same music, but recomposed. And when I kept this score, I studied it. I discovered there were an extra piece by Bortniansky installed into it. So every piece from this lost collection is a big detective story. And not just me, but there is also a colleague of mine in St. Petersburg. We are working on trying to find these pieces and to bring them back to life, to make modern score very carefully, and to find all the sources. Slowly it comes out of the guy's shells.
It sounds like a thriller.
It is. That's why I still continue working in this field.
Thanks a lot, Pavel.
For tomorrow, I will speak a little bit about Manfredini because of his symphony. For today, you follow your plan of rehearsing. Maybe if I remember something, I will be glad to tell you something. And about Bayeux, I will make a separate speech of maybe half an hour more, because this is a very recent research. I did it just because of Evgeny.
Good.
So when we decided,
Bayeux is tomorrow or this afternoon?
whenever you ask me to do that, because maybe tomorrow or after.
Well, we can start already today, but if you...
Yeah, okay, I'm ready for that. Because when we made this solution about playing Bayeux, I thought, well, I know something about Bayeux, but not too much. And then I was very lucky to find some documents that I want to describe you. And of course, yeah, if you ask about playing, follow Jenny. Thank you for attention, and also for nice questions that helped me to follow this subject. Of course, there are lots of things that have not been discussed, but maybe in the future